Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle, which is coming right up. But first, a few thoughts of my own. The future is uncertain, but one of the things that is certain and quite encouraging, we've mentioned it on this program from time to time, is the advent of entirely new materials, many of them carbon-based. Some people have said that the next century is the carbon century. I am particularly fascinated by something called graphene. It's a single layer of atoms in a matrix. It's two-dimensional. It can't be three-dimensional because it's only got one dimension, and yet it is very strong, very flexible, and promises great things. It is closely related to something you may have heard of, which is nanotubes, which are carbon tubes made from the same thing that are used to reinforce almost everything. Can reinforce a baseball bat, a cricket bat, can wrap around some sensitive product. We're seeing the very first uses of graphene in cell phones and computers as a surface covering because it is also transparent. But down the road, when we can learn to manufacture it in large sheets, all sorts of possibilities. And that is the future for us. Smaller, simpler, stronger. At a time when it is very concerning where people are going to have jobs, etc., it is wonderful to see that there is a brave new world, and it will have its own set of jobs. We talked about that on this program recently, and I'm glad to say that I've heard from people saying, right on, it is the new products, and it may be, as somebody said, the carbon century. I have a very special program for you today. We're going to talk about, in the future, defense with two of the great minds of our time, if I may be so elaborate. I'll be right back with them. You're going to enjoy this.
White House Chronicle is produced in collaboration with WHUT, Howard University Television. And now, the program host, nationally syndicated columnist Llewellyn King, and co-host Linda Gasparello.
Hello again, and thank you for coming along. When I'm in Washington, or when we have guests for this program, they stay at the American Guest House. It is a delightful place. It's half club, half bed and breakfast on Columbia Road, very central in Washington. A fine old house, nicely decorated, comfortable. I like it because people from around the world stay there, and you get into fabulous conversations over the very delectable breakfast. I promised you great people, and they are here. In particular, I'm delighted to welcome to the broadcast Amitai Etzioni of the George Washington University, who's frequently on this program, a man of enormous industry, one of the public intellectuals of our time, the author of, I think, 24 books, is that correct? And this one, Hot Spots, American Foreign Policy in a Post-Human Rights World. And there it is up on the screen. Welcome. Very nice to see you. Tell me quickly about the book.
Well, it's very much concerns with the issue of where we go next. Are we going to pivot from the Near East to the Far East on the ground that we are basically done with Al-Qaeda? They're now just a local trouble, and that our main concern now is China? Or is it a premature shift that China, if it is a threat at all, is 20, 30 years down the road, and our trouble in the Middle East are very, very serious. I'm not necessarily talking about Lebanon or Syria. I'm much more concerned about Pakistan, nuclear weapons, and the possibility that the Taliban, which tried already 6 times to grab these nuclear weapons, will get hold of them. So, and of course, Iran is, I think, still a major concern. So the question is, are we prematurely shifting? In shifting, I'm not just talking about the focus in terms of thoughts. We should have a contingency file.
I personally think we should leverage Iran against some of our other enemies, but that's a discussion for another time. Our special guest today, Mark Gunzinger, Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Tell us what that is, Mark, and welcome to the broadcast. Very nice to have you.
Happy to be here. Thank you. We're a nonprofit organization, and our focus is on the future of defense strategy, planning new operational concepts that could reshape how America fights its wars in the future, as well as the kind of capabilities needed to support the strategy, which inevitably leads to changes in the defense budget.
You have a very distinguished military career. You were a B-52 pilot and a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. You worked in the National Security Council. What is your purpose in your new job? This job?
Yes, in
How long
my
have you
new
been?
job, I've been here about 4 years.
All right,
I left the Department of Defense 4 years ago to be a senior fellow at the CSBA, as we call it. And my focus is still pretty much the focus I had when I was in the DoD. I'm focused on future capabilities, the way that evolving technologies such as robotic systems, directed energy weapons such as high-powered lasers and high-powered microwave weapons, precision-guided weapons, and the next generation of precision-guided weapons could reshape how we prepare for future conflicts, as well as what might happen or what will happen when our competitors obtain those same capabilities.
And that's fairly inevitable. That
It is not
Once
only
you
inevitable,
show you
it
can
is
do-
happening, yes.
particularly with those that are in some ways low tech, like drones, which are not necessarily that high tech. The control of them is more high tech than the actual machine.
Well, we actually see the ongoing proliferation of precision weapons in the Middle East, in the Pacific region, other areas of the world as a very significant challenge to future U.S. power projection operations. And new technologies such as robotic systems, not just air, but also sea and undersea, is lowering the barrier to entry to develop some very capable air forces and naval forces that could be used to, well, frankly, prevent our power projection forces from closing effectively into a theater.
I suppose the big question is the battle group, the ships surrounding an aircraft carrier, is that obsolete?
Well, we have a power projection versus anti-access problem. And right now, the anti-access capabilities such as anti-ship missiles, both ballistic and cruise missiles, undersea warfare capabilities, are threats to our battle groups. And the question for us is, how do we restore the punch, the offensive punch of our carrier battle groups, as well as our land-based forces? And we think there are some things the Navy could invest in that will increase their standoff distance from an enemy's shores to take them, frankly, out of the reach of those long-range anti-ship missiles that threaten them.
In other words, something very close to an intercontinental missile aimed at a ship.
Correct, such as the PLA is developing the DF-21D that has a range of about 120 nautical miles plus,
PLA
which
is
could force
People's Liberation Army.
People's Liberation's Army in China, that is correct, which could force our carriers to stand well offshore from mainland China, as well as other states who are developing similar capabilities, and that impacts their reach.
You see, I think we need to step back for a moment, because I respect endlessly what you and your center does. I think it's your patriotic duty to you and the Department of Defense to look at the horizon, see what new threats arise, and help us prepare for them. And I salute you for that and for your service. And I respect people who already been there and not just sit at a desk and send other people to fight, as I've been myself. But we need then to ask the question, when they come up and say, this is the new enemy, we need to invest a few $100 billion, which we're just saving from having finished the war in Iraq and about to finish in Afghanistan in a preparation for a new war. We need to go to the next level, to the White House. And the White House needs then to say, all right, that's what the Defense Department sees. Let me ask the State Department how they would deal with the conflict about 2 piles of rocks in the South China Sea. What would they do about people cutting fishing lines and fighting each other with water hoses in the Philippines? Should we go and build all these things? So I'm not talking about a contingency file. we should have a contingency file for everything, including an invasion from the aliens. But when we talk about hardware, once we start buying stuff, we have a very strong, long record to show. It's very difficult to stop it. Once it goes above $1 billion for weapon system, it just keeps building and building for all kinds of reasons which are well known. So we need a strategic review, not only by the Department of Defense, which does it regularly, but by the White House. And I talked to people who served there, including people who were on your show, and it's very clear we did not do that political review. For instance, how about doing a peace attack? How about going to China and saying, look, you have historical claims on these islands, Japan has claims, Vietnam, Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia all have claims. Let's go to whatever, arbitration, international court, whatever. At least before we start rolling out $100 billion of investments in ship and airplanes and missiles, we should
the history
try
of those
diplomatic
that sort of thing hasn't been very successful. So happens I'm just reading the biography of Hugh Trevor Roper, the English historian, Lord Darkly, I think he became, and all of those negotiations with Hitler, which culminated in Munich and the piece of paper, were worthless. And yet there was great faith in them at the time.
But comparing China to Hitler, that's the issue. And so the question is, in effect, they've been over the last 30 years.
No, I'm not comparing China to Hitler. I'm comparing the history of good intentions in international agreements and those agreements being violated.
I think we're talking past each other, because I wasn't talking about fighting a war with China. I'm talking about an American way of war, where we are used to responding to a threat from the United States with mass forces and building up a decisive force in theater bases that are on the borders of our enemy, and clearing the skies and having secure networks and the ability to air refuel our aircraft very close to an enemy. Now, what we see, because of the proliferation of precision weapons, robotic technologies, weapons of mass destruction, and some of these other so-called anti-access area denial threats, which are designed to constrain our ability to deploy to a theater and then operate effectively in the theater, that way of war is at peril. So what we're trying to do is assess new operational concepts or how we might operate differently to judo throw those capabilities that are emerging in the Middle East, in the Western Pacific and other areas of the world. It's not about fighting a war with China.
I'll fight for your right to do that.
Yes.
Okay.
That's precisely what folks.
But we're not talking about New Zealand or Estonia. And
right.
in your document, which is I think everybody should read, it's very, very clear that.
Well, what is this document? We haven't introduced it.
Yes, it's Air-Sea Battle. We published that in 2010, and the intent of that was to provide intellectual fodder for the development of the official air-sea battle.
In fact, in those 4 years, then, there's been a tremendous development in precision weaponry, hasn't it?
But the air-sea battle plan is aimed at basically at China, maybe also to Iran. And the Pentagon originally was quite clear about that. Then it turned out to be somewhat problematic because it agitates China and leads them to counter moves. So the Pentagon, to quote T.X. Hammers from the National Defense University, decided to walk back the concept. So we may end up fooling the American people. The Chinese will not be fooled. This build-up.
Do you have lines into the Chinese thinking? I am incapable of really in any way understanding China.
Well, let me pull out a thread on something you said. And you said it's focused on China. Well, maybe Iran. We published another document called Outside In, completely focused on the Persian Gulf and how we could counter the kinds of capabilities that we see Iran investing in to constrain freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, to possibly coerce its nearby, to equip proxies that are now in Syria and Lebanese Hezbollah and in other areas. What is it that we need to do to be able to secure stabilize that region and support our allies and friends in the region?
But China is
it is air-sea battle. but it's focused on another region, and we didn't call it air-sea battle because it's not all about the air and sea. It's a joint fight.
I understand. We even have a little place now for the army, so it's not bitching. So,
A huge role for the Army,
well,
potentially.
But something I've heard here, and let me get to that, is from Amitai talking about really asymmetrical warfare,
Yes.
low provocations, that how do you respond to the cut fishing line, the torn up net, the three people with a flag standing on a rock with the waves around their ankles.
Sure.
How do you respond to the small provocations when you have a massive military machine? Do you also have an entirely separate military machine, or is that totally diplomatic? How you just respond to the
It'll
small...
depend on the actual incident. Our job is to help our allies and partners to assure them and know that we will backstop them should a conflict begin. Not that we seek a conflict, not that we're trying to demonize China or Iran for that matter.
I'm going to take a little break here for station identification. You are listening to or watching White House Chronicle, coming to you from Washington, D.C. I am Llewellyn King, the host, and I am joined today by Amitai Etzioni of the George Washington University and by our special guest, Mark Gunzinger of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. This program can be heard on Sirius XM radio on Saturdays and Sundays, and can be seen around the world on the English language stations of the Voice of America, plus 200 domestic television stations. Please, I'm sorry to interrupt.
But we are encouraging Japan to build up its military, which is particularly provocative to China, given the history of humiliation and suffering.
Well,
give me another second. We pushing Philippines to buy more military equipment to allow us to return to their bases. We are pushing Vietnam to build up its military. We are moving ship into Singapore. Some of it is symbolic, some of it is very real. But the next message is we are somewhat like we did with the Soviet Union. We back to this idea of containment and surrounding with military forces. All this is called for once we came to the decision that what you, as you earlier suggested, that we cannot do these things through a diplomatic attack. Indeed, go back to the other point, the mistake we made in the Philippines, where we did allow them to get away with the salami tactics. That I believe we should draw the line. But when it comes to competition of ideas, when it comes to competition of trade and investment, I think we have nothing to fear, and we can hold our own very easily.
Mark, what do you see as the future of America defense? It seems to me that one of the great things that have changed, and the old lesson of defense going back historically, is you somehow took out the center, the king, the government, and this was true all the way through the Second World War, probably through Vietnam. And now that's not possible because you have a proliferation of small arms. There is no treaty to be signed. There is no armistice. These things trail on. They're never conclusive. Is our military unsuited to that? Are we too technical? In Vietnam, for example, we had an enormous amount of air power, and the enemy was in tunnels that we didn't actually know existed. We knew some of them, but not all of them. How do you see these two different things, the need to fight the localized, unscientific enemy, and the need to be ready for the potential big enemy, whoever that may be?
Well, you're cutting to the heart of what a strategic planner does, a force planner, which is what I've done most of my adult life. Not to predict the future perfectly, because that's impossible, as a fool's errand, but to take a look at the long-term trends. And we think weapons of mass destruction, increasing threat from irregular adversaries, including proxies, who could be equipped with guided rockets, artillery, mortars, and missiles, and other threats, such as long-term competitions with rising powers. Those are the kinds of things that DoD should focus on, and it could drive DoD towards building new operational constructs, such as air-sea battle and other concepts that would help them define the different capability mix they need in the future. Because today, U.S. military really is still optimized to fight another Desert Storm-like conflict that I've described earlier. And we need to be prepared for the lower-end kinds of contingencies. As I said, threats from irregular adversaries who could have high-end capabilities in the future.
That is what's
very
really,
serious.
Really frightening, is they could have high-end. You know, in Africa, in the liberation wars, there was one case, I don't want to get into it right, where an aircraft was brought down by a shoulder missile. They had not been seen in Africa before, and they had not been defended against. It was not believed to be possible. And of course, it's a fairly small weapon. It was foolish to think it wouldn't have penetrated.
I don't have any difference with that point. So we come to the question of, to the extent that we talk about China, if we are going to take out those anti-ship missiles, does it mean we have to take the war to mainland China?
Well, I think you're presuming hostilities with China when this is only one hypothesis in a very dangerous world.
Well, I differ on this point. I think we are focusing most of our high-level attention not where we should actually on Hezbollah and those where we used an anti-ship missile to take out an Israeli warship. So we are moving away from focusing on these kind of forces because for a variety of factors, in part because the Chinese are building up rapidly their military forces. So the Pentagon doesn't make this up. In part because our corporations rather build big ticket items than small stuff. So there's a combination of good forces and not so good forces, all pushing us that we need a new enemy. We are done, the president said, with Al-Qaeda. It's just kind of a local little thing. I don't see it that way. And we are shifting to focus on China.
Well, I really reject the notion that, well, we have high-end wars and we have low-end wars and we need to be able to do both. Well, yeah, we do, but that's not the way of describing it. In the future, I think a better way of describing it is the operational environment will become increasingly non-permissive at the high end and at the low end, and we're not prepared for that. And that's the focus of a lot of work that we have done recently. As far as our allies and us urging them.
How about the balance between the low end and the high end?
You absolutely need a balance in the capabilities. For example, for the Air Force, my ex-service, I'm a strong advocate of having a sophisticated fighter force, but also perhaps maintaining.
What do you mean by that, just for our...
a fifth-generation fighter force for the Department of Defense, I think, is a high priority, as is penetrating bombers with stealth technology and so forth.
Do we need man-penetrating bombers?
Yes, but also in the future, unmanned. But that doesn't mean every combat aircraft in the future should be stealthy. We also will be finding the kinds of contingencies what will be more permissive, and we have fourth-generation non-stealthy fighters and more unmanned
isn't what
aircraft.
Stealth was. The radar is better. The radar is more able to detect what were stealthy fighters a little while back.
That's one of the leveling factors. It's not just cyber weapons and precision-guided weapons, robotic technologies, but it's also computing power is advantaging our adversaries.
You have been very articulate and very importantly articulate on how we, it's a strong word, waste money on keeping bad bases or unneeded bases open, keeping, as Amitai said, obsolete weapon systems coming off the production lines. Looking to the future, the two big procurement items, there are arguments about the number of ships, but the two big procurement items that seem to be preoccupying people are the F-35, which has gotten a huge amount of money sunk in it. We'll pass over the F-22, the Osprey, and then a new bomber. That is an enormous outlay of money for a very undefined enemy, isn't it?
Well, we actually talk about DoD's new crown jewels and the need to invest in new cyber weapons, in new next generation of precision-guided weapons. penetrating ISR and strike, both manned and unmanned.
ISR,
Special Operations Forces, ISR, which is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities to detect targets. Yes, the F-35 and the long-range strike bomber are expensive, no question about it. But today's bomber force is about 34 years old on average, the oldest bomber force our nation has ever had. And we have a handful of B-2s
Do
that can
bombers
operate.
work? Do bombers work?
They work very well, and we've seen
where
that
has
in
a war been won by bombing?
Interesting question. I have never said, well, a war has been won by bombing. I say they have made important contributions to the successful outcome of a conflict along with other joint capabilities. Nor do I say wars have been won by submarines or war. It's the joint force.
I think it's a fair point. But if you listen to the list of things we should buy, we need to come back to the question of guns and butter. We also need to worry about our educational system. We also need to worry about our bridges falling
But
apart.
we also, this entire conversation suggests that it is incumbent upon us to be the world's policeman. Is it? The world is shifting. Are we going to be the only?
We need nation building at home. And the Chinese have such a huge accumulation of problems from the environment, from water, from aging population, to corruption, to their ever more ethnic tension. We both need to avoid this kind of new Cold War like arms race.
I agree, but let me go back to a point where you said that we're encouraging our allies and our partners to rearm themselves. Well, what we have been saying is states like Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and in the Persian Gulf region, perhaps they could invest in their own anti-access capabilities to harden themselves.
Are you going to deduct from our budget whatever Japan spends? Can I have that in writing?
Well, first they have to spend it, of course, okay. But and we hope also the capabilities that they buy will be interoperable, like they're buying the F-35, for example.
Fair point.
We're coming towards the end of our program. I think it's very interesting, and I think we should continue it in a future program. Meanwhile, I'd like to remind people that Amitai's book is Hotspots, American Foreign Policy in a Post-Human Rights World. And where do we find your study, and where should people look for your work, Mark?
Yes, it's online at CSBA, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and we have all of our publications and reports posted there.
That's our show for today. We're so glad you came along. Please come back next week if you can. In the meanwhile, all the best and peace to you. Cheers.
White House Chronicle is produced in collaboration with WHUT, Howard University Television. From Washington, D.C., this has been White House Chronicle, a weekly analysis of the news with insight and a sense of humor, featuring Llewellyn King, Linda Gasparello, and guests. This program may be seen on PBS stations and cable access channels. To view the program online, visit us at whitehousechronicle.com.